All right, guys, so I'm a little bit behind on Diablo 4 news. I know they had released some patch notes saying that they had made some buffs and nerfs based on sort of beta feedback. I'm a little skeptical on this. I'm hoping that, in all honesty, they didn't only make changes based on the beta feedback. I actually hope that if they did decide to make changes, they did it based on internal testings and beta feedback, because most people in the beta didn't make it far enough into the game, in my view, to be able to offer honest criticisms about how balanced the classes were. Let's get in here though. Let's check it out.
Alright guys, Diablo 4 is making some big changes with a brand new patch from the beta feedback. We're getting a drastic update to dungeon gameplay, mechanics, class balance, and a lot more. So let's get started. Diablo 4 open beta retrospective, transforming feedback into change. Of course, one of the most common pieces of feedback from the open beta was that players felt there was a lot of backtracking within certain dungeons, like for example having to retreat to the same path, retrieving carryable objects, and so on. So Blizzard came in and optimized multiple of these across all zones to minimize that as much as
Here's the list. Specifically in the Fractured Peak zone. So the Fractured Peak zone was the zone that we played in. So they're going to like limit the amount of backtracking we did. Most of that is going to be based on either layout changes or just object placements. So I mean, this is probably going to be a good thing. Like, I can't say that it's not going to be a good thing. But we didn't get to play these in like their final form. So, I mean, I'm definitely excited to see this though. They nerfed the barbs by 10%. They're still going to be the best in game. Is that what Rax is saying? I mean, I don't know why barbs would be best in game, but we definitely have to check it out.
Possible. You can of course see a list of some of the affected dungeons, but there are a lot more improvements to these gameplay mechanics coming too. One of them, and the biggest here, is to structure objectives, which now have been repositioned to appear more along the main dungeon pathway.
After defeat. All right. So that does help. There were a few things in some of the dungeon layouts where you had to go like off a couple extra rooms. I don't think that it was necessarily bad. So let me explain. I don't think that the dungeons in their original form were bad. The problem was there was nothing in the dungeons. There were a lot of times when you were running through dungeons, and what I noticed as I played them was that there was just nothing in there. So there was no reason to go off on a side room or break a door or go an alternate route, because there were no breakables. The breakables that you did break very nearly dropped nothing, and there was never a reason to really explore. So if you would have not enough enemies, which was also an issue, yeah. Well, if there would have been a reason, right? Like, so if there would have been like elites in those rooms for you to go kill, and those elites would have dropped gear, then more people would have went in more side rooms because they would have been looking for elites. Now, at the end game, people wouldn't have cared. They would have been trying to run things the fastest way possible, and going in the side rooms wouldn't matter. Are you guys special? It just dropped dust? Yeah. So there were definitely some design issues here, and streamlining the paths is going to help, but it's not going to fix the issue. And the issue was that a lot of the areas just felt unrewarding, and there was no reason to go check them.
Making them easier to reach and allowing players to readily explore the dungeon after defeating the structure. Another way they made that a lot easier is to also make doors generate a minimap ping when they are opened. Even more so when carrying stuff like ancient statues, bloodstones, mechanical boxes, or stone carvings. Now you'll receive a momentum buff, granting a 25% movement speed increase to you and your nearby allies. I'm glad
the move, I mean, honestly, if you're backtracking, like the only reason to add the buff is to help you get back while you're backtracking, because like logically it wouldn't make sense that you would move faster carrying something. But I mean, if it's going to get you back faster, then I mean, I'm all for it. I don't know. Did you ever clear a dungeon only to find you missed a pack or an objective that was hidden? The only time I even cared was if it was a clear the entire dungeon, because most of the time it wasn't worth the effort. You know what I mean? That was the biggest issue I had with Diablo 4's beta, was that a lot of times nothing felt like it was worth the effort. Not only because it was a beta and it was going to get reset, but like the additional effort of going to explore stuff with no guarantee of finding anything or getting anything good, and like not a lot of chests, not a lot of resplendent chests, not a lot of monsters dropping items that are even worth having, lack of breakables and stuff like that. It just made like the whole exploring thing for me feel very unrewarding in general. You're in exploration. Yeah. It didn't happen, at least not during your beta time, for sure. They fixed the thing, changing layouts and making mobs chase you now. If they make the mobs chase you, I mean, that's definitely going to make melee classes feel better for sure. Not enough enemies, too much wasted space. I think that was the biggest issue I had. Welcome back, Terry. Was it just felt like a lot of the dungeons were wasted spaces. Like, I didn't mind backtracking. I don't mind running a very long distance. Just make it to where it feels interesting. Because, like Diablo 3, right? Diablo 3's rifts are not very interesting. There's not a lot to do in them. Like, I don't really care to explore. But you move through it so fast that it doesn't matter. The thing that I noticed in Diablo 4 was because you didn't run like a fucking methed out crack addict, was that because you didn't do that, everything felt really far away and it just felt empty. Now, if you ran 5 times your normal speed, it wouldn't matter because you would be in and out of rooms so fast that it wouldn't matter what was even in there. And, most classes have like AoEs that are just going to break everything anyway. And then even when they do break it, you're not collecting it, your pet's collecting it. That's what I'm hoping, Mayruko. That's what I've maintained the whole time. Yeah, the objective gives 25% more move speed. That's going to help on like moving back and forth.
They actually did it this way, and it's literally fixing all the issues exactly how the community wanted since day one. This was actually one of the most suggested ways to fix some of the backtracking, especially when carrying back the objects. But Blizzard actually thought this through all the way and made a few more adjustments.
Exactly, Ern. There's over 120 dungeons. We saw less than a fifth of them. And we didn't see any of them with modifiers or nightmare sigils on it. Which is why at least the decisions for the changes to the dungeons don't really seem negative in any way, because all it's going to do at the end of the day is make the dungeons a more enjoyable experience. And I don't think that that's necessarily a negative. And I feel like even though we only got to see a little bit in the beta, the Diablo's side probably saw enough to go, we're going to go ahead and make these changes now. And these aren't really going to be sort of changes that will affect the balance of the game.
On top, this includes, of course, channel time for pedestals being reduced from 2 seconds all the way to 0, and returning a portable object to its pedestal now also fully restores health, resources, potions, and fully resets cooldowns.
So the only reason I'm even okay with it, like refilling all of your like resources and stuff in the dungeon, is because you have no real passive regen, at least that I've seen yet. Maybe at later stages of the game we will, but I didn't really see a lot of like passive regen, so it's fine, especially because like you get so many potions when you play the game that it's really not gonna matter
for all players. But there's more. They actually added a small number of straggling monsters that will seek out players to help them complete, especially the kill all monsters objectives. Again, this was also suggested by the community, so Blizzard doing a great job at listening.
Yeah, the kill all monsters dungeons are always going to be terrible. I almost feel like the red dots should just show up on the map from further away. Like, if you have to kill them all, mark them all the whole time.
Believe it or not, another one is to the animus resource dropping from enemies in certain dungeons that you would have to then deposit inside of a cauldron to open the dungeon areas ahead. This one now provides the following benefits upon picking up these animus orbs, including one giving you back 10 resources and others reducing all active cooldowns by 1 second. So pretty nice, giving it some additional gameplay functions.
Yeah, hopefully that's not going to be too much of a buff, because if that's too much of a buff, then those are the dungeons people are going to farm because you'll just be able to spam abilities, right?
They even reduce the dreadful...
That's the only concern I have, like, is you're just sitting there holding a point. It's no different than holding a point in any of the other dungeons, but now your goal is specifically to hold that point, and you're going to get resource regeneration and cooldowns on your skills, which is going to make it super efficient and super effective to sit there and do it. Yeah. All cooldowns reset before the boss room. That's interesting.
Long 3-second deposit channel time all the way to 0, making them a pretty much instant cast. Now for the rescue minigame, as I'm sure you found this quite common in some of the ice-themed dungeons, all rescues now also drop health potions upon completion to maybe help you a bit with surviving, especially since they also spawn enemies.
So I have an honest question for you guys, like completely honest question. Were you running out of potions? Like, was your survivability hindered by your lack of potions? I personally felt like there were enough potions scattered throughout that I didn't have any issues. On DH, you were running out of potions. Lemon, you were as well. See, I never really had any issues. Like, there was... I could probably count on one hand how many times I found myself in the beta sitting on 0 potions and just having to play cautious. On Necro, you hardly used them. Once, ran out of potions. Fearing not being able to complete a boss. Now, there were definitely times where I used a lot of them, and that was either my fault, bad positioning, or stuff like that. So, okay, so then it sounds like this is going to be a net positive for a lot of people. I don't really mind one way or the other. Especially, I mean, because like Diablo 3, you have unlimited potions, right? You're just hindered by only being able to use them every 30 seconds. Diablo 4, you don't only have... I mean, you have a finite amount, but you can use them as fast as you need to. For me, user error, not using the dodge button much. See, that makes sense.
Plus the time...
See, I didn't have a lot of issues on my ranger. Like my rogue, I didn't really feel like I had that much of an issue at all.
to rescue has been reduced from 3 seconds all the way to 1.5. Moving on though, probably one of the most exciting changes is to the sellers as well as dungeon events.
That's what I mean, my rogue. I mean, it's not going to hurt anybody for sure. You mean your rogue? That's what I figured you were talking about.
Which are now getting a few cool buffs to make them a lot more common. So the chance for an event to spawn inside of a dungeon has increased from 10% to 60%, which is rather drastic. And similarly, sellers...
I don't even know what events they're talking about in dungeons. I would need like specific sort of information on what is classified as an event. Like the cursed events and stuff like that. I mean, I think 60% chance is good. We just curse pylons and chest. What my fear is, right? What my fear is what they're not saying here, which is, okay, so we gave you these events and we had them set as a 1 in 10 chance. So now we've given you a 6 in 10 chance to have them happen. But we can't give you a 6 in 10 chance to gain extra loot, because that's going to off-balance the loot grind that we at Blizzard, Activision, whatever, want to create in our game. So you will see them 6 times more frequently, or 5 times more often, but you will get loot from them 5 times less frequently, which will then make them feel less rewarding. Does that make sense? Now, it doesn't say specifically that they did that in the patch notes, but in my mind, if you increase the odds from 10% to 60%, you're going to have to make them feel less rewarding when you do them. Or else it's just going to be just a shower of loot, right? The sellers were completely pointless. Like, I completely quit going in sellers because they were pointless. I'm curious if they had goblin packs like in D3. I imagine they will at some point. I would hope.
Also got an increased chance for an event.
But remember, we were only playing on World Tier 1. Maybe there's something that only happens on World Tier 3 and above.
To occur inside of them. They will even consistently reward a chest upon completion.
The seller should always reward a chest upon first completion. Now, maybe you shouldn't be able to farm it, but the very first time you do it, you should always get a fucking chest. First seller, yeah. Promising riches and shit. Yeah, I felt really bad going into sellers, and that's what made me stop going into them.
And they also fixed the bug where the guaranteed
I knew what you were
enemy
saying.
would be absent from inside of them. The main reason you would jump into sellers especially was for the chance, albeit small, to spawn multiple loot goblins inside of them, and when that happened, you'd basically get a massive loot shower. I imagine that between the increased spawn rate of events and the now guaranteed spawn rate of elites, as well as reward chests, you get even more incentives to complete these, plus the fact that they also count to the open world like challenge tracks and so on.
Right.
But encounters like the Butcher and other bosses are getting some buffs as well as fixes.
Yeah, because like, so for a lot of us, right, like the first couple times you saw the Butcher, it was pretty scary. But then after you were geared out, when it showed up, it became way less scary. The Butcher has been reevaluated for difficulty and will present greater challenges in World Tiers 3 and 4. That makes sense.
So this issue that allowed the Butcher, for example, to become unresponsive has already been addressed. This was especially noticeable when playing with classes that had minions, so it would cause the boss to basically just remain still and not do anything. So yeah, do say goodbye to that. Also, the Butcher difficulty gets increased massively to present an even greater challenge, especially in World Tier 3 and World.
You got stuck on an invisible wall. You were livid. Yeah, it's probably the same dungeon that there was a couple dungeons that just had invisible walls. And if you didn't know, I could see how that would make you really mad.
Tier 4. Furthermore, various bosses were re-evaluated for melee character difficulty, resulting in changes to attack.
Yeah, you can see like them doing it on their mage, and I think on the barbarian before. They're fighting this Butcher at level 25. And they're just completely mopping the floor with it because they have legendaries.
And fight mechanics. Certain bosses punished melee builds a lot more than, for example, ranged ones. And here's hoping that these will also include some of the annoying spider bosses that we kept, like seeing throwing us back in one of the early zone dungeons. There were plenty more examples like these. Finally, the vampire brutes using the shadow enchant were fixed to no longer chain cast impale. If you got like in a situation such as in one of the strongholds where it would spawn 2 or more of these.
Guys, try to put distance. Yeah, and it was fully wasted opportunity. Yeah, there were definitely times where I didn't clear the Butcher just because of that. Like, things similar.
These enemies, you could literally get impaled back to back and stunned for a very long time, plus a massive life drain if you did not pay attention to their charge up attacks. So yeah, this has been addressed too. But the new update is massive and a lot of balance changes are on the list too, starting with barbarian buffs. We get a flat 10% passive damage reduction, but at the cost of some skill tree passives to have their damage reduction effects.
You know what though? The flat passive damage reduction and then not having to take those passives in your tree, that's a net gain for the barbarian.
Reduced to compensate for that. No worries.
All right, so before we get into these, I just want to sort of iterate what I said earlier. I don't think that buffing or nerfing any of the characters based on the beta feedback is a good idea. You are looking at a very small window of playtime, and then making adjustments. Like you're making adjustments. Where's my thing? So, if this is like sort of if this is the timeline of the character, right? Instead of waiting till the end game back here and making an adjustment, right? And then that adjustment could have this much of an effect, right? We'll say this little period here. This is going to be the effect that you could have. Changing something up here goes like this. It completely exaggerates how much of an impact the change point done at this point in a character development can change things, because this little change here can be either can make something like OP, or it can make it like trash, right? It makes no sense, exactly. So you have to be very careful with making any change at this point, because your outcomes can be so much more exaggerated. And I'm sure it wasn't purely based on player feedback, and that's what I said in my tweet, was I really hope this wasn't based purely on the feedback from the beta, and that it was based on internal testing plus player experiences during the beta. And I personally didn't want to see any balance changing or tweaking until players got to the end game post-launch. Like, I didn't want to see a buff or a nerf until, like, I don't know, a couple weeks into the first season, when people were starting to hit this line here. That's just me. Flat passive damage reduction.
On which ones they are, but it's likely going to be a more blanket change.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna have to go back because, all right. Whirlwind skill now deals more damage and consumes more fury. Let's hope the memory leaks got fixed too. Yeah, I think so. So, like, Whirlwind dealing more damage and consuming more fury, that's going to help you, like, spike out more damage. The question is, how does that affect the Barbarian in the end game when he has ways to passively regenerate fury while he's already doing damage? Because then what that means is your Whirlwind is just going to constantly deal more damage because you're not going to run out of fury, right? Double swing skill enchantment refunds its full fury cost when used on stunned or knocked down enemies. I would have to look at the skill to see what that does. I mean, what that's going to let you do is just continuously keep doing it, right? So what that's saying is whatever double swing skill that it is, if you're using it on a stunned enemy, that you just get the full cost back every time. So you can constantly do it as long as you can keep enemies stunned or knocked down.
On which ones they are, but it's likely going to be a more blanket change affecting multiple perks like the Combat Flay or Martial Vigor, maybe even some of the Shout passive upgrades later on. They also made Whirlwind skills now deal more damage, but also at the cost of consuming more fury. This is likely going to make fury generation a bit more annoying early on with this setup, but I assume that once we get some of the shouts in, like Rallying Cry and other ways to generate more fury, it should all even out. Finally, the double swing skill enhancement refunds its full fury cost when...
Yeah, lucky hit chance, sweep your weapons, dealing 36%. I almost feel like, depending on how well this works, it might make double swing be better than Whirlwind, but I'd have to see it like in game with all of its perk tree.
Used on stunned or knocked down enemies, which is a pretty drastic buff from the 15 fury that it provided before. Moving on to another disadvantaged class, we have the Druids, which get a pretty interesting buff, so their companions now deal heavily increased damage. The wolves especially seem to benefit the most out of these, especially if you combine them with some of the other legendary aspects. There were ones that would provide like additional wolves, some that would transform your wolves into werewolves, which are a lot more stronger. Also ones that would increase companion damage as a whole, so this would likely be one of the go-to builds for melee damage early on, and the companions were already super strong in the open beta as it was, even one-shotting certain bosses with a full-on legendary setup like that.
So yeah, I'm curious to see how that's going to change things, because I had heard that the Druid was very heavily disadvantaged during the beta because it didn't have access to everything. And that everybody needed to wait to see the Druid in its final form, right? Once we got further in the game. So now if its companions are even stronger and people were already doing pretty crazy shit with the companions, I imagine I might have to walk that back. Adjusted, but it was data mined, maybe. And that might be part of it, right? Like adjusting legendaries on the back end, but just making it look good on paper on the front end.
But Droids also see their ultimate skills have their cooldowns reduced, a change that should benefit builds that ran with the Cataclysm or the Petrify skills a lot, and this should help a ton with nuking down enemies and bosses. The patch notes also list usability improvements to maul and pulverize, but using a non-shape-shifting skill.
Companion skills will now deal heavily increased damage. Ultimates. Abilities, non-shape-shifting. Well, that's interesting that using a non-shapeshift skill will transform you back into your human form. It just seems like something you'll have to pay attention to.
Will also transform the Droid now back into the human form. This last change right here could be a pretty significant nerf, especially to the more hybrid kind of builds that would both utilize, for example, elemental attacks as well as the shape-shifting attacks. So in this situation, you would lose some of the very potent buffs that you would get as a bear or a wolf form, like mending, which would give you some nice healing from all sources. There's plenty other like similar mechanics in there that you will no longer benefit since you immediately turn back to human. It's nice, however, to see that the Rogue Subterfuge skills get some love with an increase to the bonuses they provide. However, besides Dark Shroud in this category, I've literally never used any of the other Subterfuge skills, but maybe this will make Poison Traps or skills like the Vanish a bit more appealing in the mid to late game. Finally, I'm now convinced.
Yeah, I used a lot of poison on my rogue. I didn't have any issues with it.
Means that Sorcerer is Blizzard's favorite class because it literally got even more buff despite already being the top strongest class in Diablo 4 open beta. So charged bolt damage was increased and its mana cost has been decreased. This was a change that they talked about previously, where they wanted some of the other early skills to also be useful. In this case,
they also talked about how the Sorcerer felt really good in the beta, but it didn't scale very well.
I'm still probably not going to change from the Chain Lightning or the Frozen Orb since they are a lot more useful. Decrease the cooldown for the Incinerate skill enchantment bonus, which was previously just 20 seconds.
Decrease the damage of Chain Lightning and reduce its effectiveness against bosses.
So yeah, now it's going to be lower than that. Meanwhile, Firewall will now spawn underneath enemies more frequently when used in the enchantment slot. And finally, they increase the lucky hit chance for the Meteor skills enchantment bonus too. The Meteor change in this case sounds the most appealing to me just because it sounds like a really cool setup that you can create. So the chance for that to happen was 3% previously, now it should be like bigger, I guess. So it's probably going to be more worth it to go with a damage over time fire build that has a chance to spawn a lot of meteors on enemies' heads.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of builds that could be more viable now, but until we have access to all the gear, we really have no idea.
I think that would be a sight to behold. Anyway, on a final note, some big UI changes are coming too, including ways to remap the move, interact, and primary attack input.
I heard they fixed the middle mouse wheel
To different buttons, but probably the most significant is the font used in game to now be replaced with a different new one.
So that is not, to me, the most important thing out of that whole thing is the middle mouse wheel being able to be bound. Yeah, like I mentioned this earlier. I didn't give a shit about the font in the game.
There have been quite a few controversies surrounding the font and the UI that Blizzard chose to use in Diablo 4, some even saying that it looked a bit too like mobile game-ish. Personally, I found it to look fine, but it's nice to see that Blizzard admits that there's room for improvements and are actively improving upon it. That's pretty much it with the changes. Thanks so much for watching, and
so after going through it all, there's definitely some changes there. Most of them seemed good. Nothing seemed that crazy, right? There wasn't anything that crazy or major. The layout changes for the dungeons, it sounds like it's just going to be optimizing sort of where they put things, and that they're not going to remodel and remap the entire dungeon. And if they can't optimize things, you're at least going to have a move bonus that's going to help. Enemies are going to sort of look for you a little bit more in dungeons where you have to clear everything. The buffs and nerfs, I stand behind what I said. I don't think a lot of the buffs and nerfs are the best idea to do early game. So I'm going to hope that these were more things that they were already maybe planning on and just wanted to see some of the feedback from the beta. Welcome back, Burns. But that's just kind of my thought on it. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let me know what you think of the changes. If there were any changes that didn't happen that you wanted to see from the beta going into the live game. He didn't mention players can't use it as a cheat death or just go farm elites. Yeah. And neat, makes sense. It did. And I think, I can't remember if I saw a video on it or I watched somebody talk about it or mention it, but it sounded like the only reason the reset button was in there was because it was a beta and it was to let people sort of reset because they didn't have as much stuff to do. And it was never planned to be like a full release feature. So it makes sense that they kind of took it out because it did seem kind of cheesy just to run a dungeon and then just hit a button and be right back at the beginning of it and just rerun it. In the final game, I mean, obviously you're going to have sigils and stuff like that. And that's probably going to be your limiting factor anyway. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And as always, have a great day.